As you know, all of Austen's stories end with marriage, or at least the promise of marriage. Also, any man who shows any interest in the main female character is a potential husband for her. In Persuasion, there are 3 men who showed some interest in Anne: Captain Wentworth, Captain Benwick, and Mr. Elliot, and one of them is her future husband. We can eliminate Captain Benwick since he's now engaged to Louisa. This leaves Captain Wentworth and Mr. Elliot. One is very angry with her, and the other she doesn't fully trust. So, who will it be? These 2 chapters will tell us. The events of Chapter 21 happen the morning after the concert that happens in Chapter 20. Anne goes to visit her friend Mrs. Smith. She's hoping, in part, to avoid Mr. Elliot, who she knows is going to be at Camden Place that morning. She likes Mr. Elliot, but she loves Captain Wentworth. That will never change, and it isn't useful to think about what could be with Mr. Elliot if Captain Wentworth weren't in the picture, because he is. Mrs. Smith is a little surprised to see her that morning, even though this was a planned visit. The 2 discussed the concert. Anne and her family were invited by Lady Dalrymple to be guests at the concert. After the usual discussion of where Anne and her group sat, who was there, and how nice the concert was, Mrs. Smith says she can see in Anne's eyes that she had a good time at the concert. Anne was surprised that Mrs. Smith could see that. Mrs. Smith said that Anne was in the company of her most favorite person in the world. Anne blushed, but didn't say anything. Mrs. Smith thanks Anne for coming to visit, even though she's probably more preoccupied with pleasanter thoughts and activities. Anne didn't really hear that because she was surprised her friend knew about her feelings for Captain Wentworth. She probably started thinking about what happened in Chapter 20 with Captain Wentworth. You see, at the concert, she had an opportunity to talk to Captain Wentworth. Anne and Wentworth started with pleasantries. You know, the weather, Bath, the concert, but then the conversation started to lag. She kind of expected him to leave because, they weren't really talking about anything, but he didn't. After a short lull in the conversation, Captain Wentworth brought up Lyme, Louisa's accident, and Louisa and Captain Benwick. He's surprised that Anne wants to visit Lyme again, but she says she isn't letting a few bad hours taint the whole experience. They talk a little about Louisa and Captain Benwick. He says the Musgroves are acting appropriately in that they are embracing the marriage for their daughter's happiness. What a dig at Anne's family is that? Captain Wentworth seems surprised that Benwick fell for Louisa because, 1, he was so in love with Fanny, and Louisa is far inferior to Fanny. 2, Benwick is intelligent, and Captain Wentworth thinks he would be more interested in a woman more on his intellectual level. And 3rd, maybe Benwick learned to love Louisa because she liked him so much. Then I think he realized he may be speaking a little too ill of Louisa, so he changed and he said he thinks that they would be happy together. Great, now Anne knows how he really feels about Louisa and is confident that he's not upset at all about Benwick stealing his girl. So far this evening couldn't have gone any better than Anne could have expected, but then the rest of Anne's group came and the concert started and she was separated from Captain Wentworth. While the first part of the concert went on, her thoughts were not of the concert, but instead of her interaction with Captain Wentworth. She's starting to think that his feelings for her have changed, that there is some of the tenderness of the past. She's determined that he must love her. When Anne is able to talk to Captain Wentworth again, he's not like he was. He seemed more like he had been at Uppercross. But as they talked, her pleasantness softened him, and he at one point looked down at the empty seat as if he was considering sitting down. But then that stupid Mr. Elliot came over and asked her to translate something for Miss Carteret. She had to sacrifice her time with Captain Wentworth, and when she was done, Wentworth found her and told her he was leaving. She tried to entice him to stay by pointing out the songs that were coming up, but he wouldn't stay. He told her there was nothing worth staying for. Why in the world would he say it like that? She could only conclude Mr. Elliot. He's jealous of Mr. Elliot. She wishes so much that Captain Wentworth knew her true feelings of Mr. Elliot. Well, gosh, now I'm wondering, what are her true feelings for Mr. Elliot? Anne was pulled back to her visit with Mrs. Smith when Miss Smith asked if Mr. Elliot was aware that she was in Bath. Anne was surprised. Oh my goodness, does she think that Anne is in love with Mr. Elliot? Goodness, she doesn't even know anything about Captain Wentworth. Anne asked Mrs. Smith if she knows Mr. Elliot. Oh, yes, she knows Mr. Elliot. They were good friends, but they haven't seen each other for some time, and she would like Anne to talk to Mr. Elliot about something on her behalf. Anne said she would be happy to talk to Mr. Elliot on her behalf, but she wanted Mrs. Smith to know that her relationship with Mr. Elliot was cousins only. Mrs. Smith apologized and said she should have waited until the relationship between the two were made official. Anne was like, no. We are not getting married. I am not marrying Mr. Elliot. But Mrs. Smith still isn't swayed. She says every woman plays coy and says she's not engaged until the moment she is asked. But then she wants to know why Anne is being so cruel to deny the relationship to her. Then she says all kinds of nice things about Mr. Elliot, about how she thought they'd be happy together and that he won't make the same mistakes about money that her husband did. Anne insists in the strongest way possible that she had no intentions of marrying Mr. Elliot. I would not marry him here or there. I would not marry him anywhere. I would not marry Mr. Elliot. I do not like him, Mrs. Smith, or something to that effect. And she almost caught herself saying that she was in love with Captain Wentworth. Finally, Mrs. Smith believes her. Now Anne's curious. Why would Mrs. Smith think that the two were engaged? And Mrs. Smith said it's because they spend all kinds of time together and everyone in town is saying that they're courting, including her friends and family. Now that they've gotten that misunderstanding straightened out, Anne still offers to talk to Mr. Elliot for her, but suddenly Mrs. Smith has changed her mind about that. Seemingly not curious in the least about that, she starts asking Mrs. Smith how she knew Mr. Elliot. At first, Mrs. Smith gave short, vague answers, but then something came over her and she changed. She said she's been hiding some things, and now that she's sure of Anne's feelings for Mr. Elliot, she wanted to tell Anne about Mr. Elliot's true nature. Oh, Mrs. Smith is about to spill some tea here. Mrs. Smith says, Mr. Elliot is a man without heart or conscience, a designing, wary, cold-blooded being who thinks only of himself, whom for his own interest or ease would be guilty of any cruelty or any treachery that could be perpetrated without risk of his general character. He has no feeling for others. Those whom he has been the chief cause of leading into ruin, he can neglect and desert without the smallest of compunction. He is totally beyond reach of any sentiment of justice or compassion. Oh, he is black at heart, hollow and black. Oh boy, did you see that coming? Wait, if this is what she really thinks of Mr. Elliot, why did she say all those nice things about him and tell Anne that they would be happy together? Well, we don't know because Anne doesn't ask that. Mrs. Smith says that she is an injured and angry woman, but she would try to be honest about Mr. Elliot and try not to abuse his character. She said he was very close friends with her husband before they got married. She came to think highly of him, and the three of them were always together. At that time, Mr. Elliot was not very well off, but he tried to still have the air of a gentleman. They allowed him to stay with them whenever he needed to, because he was like a brother to her husband. Her husband helped him financially and would have split his last penny with Mr. Elliot. Anne hears this and realizes that this is about the same time that Mr. Elliot met Sir Walter, and so she wanted to know about Mr. Elliot from that time. Mrs. Smith knew all about that time. In fact, Mr. Elliot confided in her about his hopes and plans. Anne asked why Mr. Elliot drew back from his acquaintance with her father. Mrs. Smith explained that he was determined to get rich fast, which meant marrying into money as quickly as possible, but marrying Elizabeth would mean he would have to wait for his inheritance. After meeting Sir Walter and Elizabeth, he constantly talked about them to Mrs. Smith. He would talk about the one Miss Elliot, and she would talk about the other. This reminded Anne of a conversation she had with Mr. Elliot at the concert. He told her that he knew of her for some years before meeting her, and he knew how wonderful a person she was, but he refused to say who it was who told him of her. At that time, she assumed it must have been Mr. Wentworth of Monkford, Captain Wentworth's brother. But now she's wondering if maybe Mrs. Smith talked about her. Oh yes, Mrs. Smith said. She spoke of Anne often and how she was a different creature than... Mrs. Smith stopped. She probably thought, oh, watch out, girl, you're about to step in something. All right, so now Anne knows how Mr. Elliot knew of her. Then Anne asked Mrs. Smith to continue on. And Mrs. Smith said, back then the three were friends. They were thoughtless and lived for enjoyment only. She's different now. For Mr. Elliot's wife, he made sure of her fortune before he was willing to marry her. His interest in her was her money only. She offered proof of what she was saying, but Anne insisted she didn't need any, as it just confirmed what she already observed of him for herself. Now, we knew Anne was somewhat suspicious of him, but, I don't know about you, I didn't think her thoughts of him were that dark. Anne was curious why he was so different now. Yes, I think we all want to know that. Mrs. Smith had Anne retrieve a box from Mrs. Smith's closet. Mrs. Smith sighed and then opened it. She explained it was full of papers that were her husband's, though it was a small portion of what she had to look over when he passed away. The particular letter she wanted to show Anne was a letter from Mr. Elliot to her husband before they married. Though she was not happy with Mr. Elliot, she would not dare discard any letters from him, and now she's really happy she kept it. Okay, I have to point this out. Her husband's name was Charles, too. I mean, good grief. Did Austen have some kind of brain issue when she wrote this book that she could only come up with Charles as a first name for her characters? I mean, I know she was falling ill when writing this novel, but really. All right, so the letter is about Sir Walter and Kellynch. Dear Smith, I have received yours. Your kindness almost overpowers me. I wish nature had made such hearts as yours more common. But I have lived 23 years in the world and have seen none like it. At present, believe me, I have no need of your services being in cash again. Give me joy. I have got rid of Sir Walter and Miss. They are back to Kellynch, and almost made me swear to visit them this summer. But my first visit to Kellynch will be with a surveyor to tell me how to bring it with best advantage to the hammer. The baronet, nevertheless, is not unlikely to marry again. He is quite fool enough. If he does, however, they will leave me in peace, which may be a decent equivalent for the reversion. He is worse than last year. I wish I had any name but Elliot. I am sick of it. The name of Walter I can drop, thank God. And I desire you will never insult me with my second W again. Meaning, for the rest of my life, to be only yours truly, W.M. Elliot. As you can imagine, Anne was shocked and mortified by this. She thanked Mrs. Smith for showing her the letter, but she's still not sure why Mr. Elliot would want to get to know them now. He truly wanted to marry Anne, and his interest in her family was genuine as well, Mrs. Smith insisted, because she heard it from her nurse, who heard it from Mrs. Wallace. Heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend. It turned out that Mr. Elliot talked to Colonel Wallace all about Anne, and he told his wife, who then gossiped with her nurse. Since her nurse was also Mrs. Smith's nurse, she told Mrs. Smith what Mrs. Wallace told her. Anne, of course, admonished Mrs. Smith for believing in silly gossip. To prove it was not simply silly gossip, Mrs. Smith asked Anne if Mr. Elliot had seen her before they met in Bath, when he didn't know who she was. Anne had to agree with that. So there, my friend is correct on that respect, so maybe she's also correct on other things. Mrs. Smith continued, he saw you and liked you enough to be happy to meet you again. But that wasn't the only reason for hanging around your family. You see, before Mr. Elliot came to Bath, Colonel Wallace happened to be paying attention to what was happening at Camden Place because of their friendship. He didn't visit Camden Place, but he did watch the goings-on and came to a conclusion that Mrs. Clay was clever, charming, pretty, and a poor woman who had intentions toward Sir Walter, and Miss Elliot was none the wiser. When Mr. Elliot came to Bath for a few days just before Christmas, Colonel Wallace told him all about Mrs. Clay. Mrs. Smith tells us that time and money had changed Mr. Elliot. Having all the money he wants, he was bored with the things he could buy, and he was looking for happiness in other areas, like the baronetcy. Mrs. Smith saw this starting before she stopped hanging out with him. Hearing of Mrs. Clay's intentions, Mr. Elliot decided to come to Bath to figure out for himself whether she would succeed in her attempts. He came and immediately set out to get Sir Walter's forgiveness and to spend as much time with the family as possible. Anything to try to thwart Mrs. Clay. That was his only motive, until Anne came to Bath, and now he had a second motive for being around the family. Anne was not altogether surprised about this. She never really bought the idea that he was a changed man and that he just wanted to be part of the family. Anne said she'd like to know what Mr. Elliot thought of Mrs. Clay now. Is she more likely or less likely to succeed? Mrs. Smith said that it was her understanding that Mrs. Clay is less likely to succeed. She knows that Mr. Elliot sees right through her, and she's afraid of him and doesn't dare do as she pleases around him. Anne was happy to hear all of this. But wait, Mrs. Smith told Anne that she was injured and angry at Mr. Elliot. But all of this information can't be what has her angry at Mr. Elliot. What could possibly be the reason she's angry with him? Well, it turns out that Mr. Smith was generous with his friend when Mr. Elliot was in need. After Mr. Elliot became rich, he, instead of helping his friend, encouraged his friend to live beyond his means, and this ruined Mr. Smith financially. Luckily, he died before knowing how bad things really were. Since Mr. Elliot was such close friends with Mr. Smith, he made Mr. Elliot his executor of his will. But Mr. Elliot refused to deal with the estate. Mrs. Smith showed Anne some letters she sent to Mr. Elliot, begging him to help her, but he did nothing. Anne thought it was a dreadful picture of ingratitude and inhumanity. Anne couldn't imagine another crime worse than this. Well, I could imagine, but I get her point. There was one thing that irked Mrs. Smith more than anything. Her husband owned a small property in the West Indies and had a lien on it. If she could deal with the lien and fix up the property, it would make her somewhat rich, but Mr. Elliot would do nothing to help her. And her illness, lack of money to hire help, and lack of friends in high places prevented her from being able to obtain the property. This is what she wanted Anne to talk to Mr. Elliot about when she thought Anne was going to marry Mr. Elliot. Anne finally wondered why Mrs. Smith was like, "Oh, he's great, he's wonderful, he'll make you very happy." What's that? You won't marry him no matter what? Well, then let me tell you, he's a horrible bastard. Mrs. Smith claimed that when she thought they were going to marry, she couldn't say anything because it would probably ruin their friendship, so she had to bite her tongue. She also thought that, though he was horrible to his first wife, he is sensible and agreeable, and Anne was such a good person that maybe she could change him. Anne started thinking about her and Mr. Elliot. She thought that Lady Russell might have actually been able to convince her to marry Mr. Elliot. Anne shuddered at the thought that she might have married him and the misery that probably would have caused her.